My father, Silas Croft, was the most respected man in Redemption Creek, a pillar of virtue, built from scripture and granite. But to cleanse his shame, he banished me, his 8-month pregnant daughter, to the one place worse than death, the badlands. He was sending me to a monster, a recluse giant named Jonas, a man who was meant to be my punishment, my life sentence. My father thought he was burying his secret. He didn't know he was sending me straight to the father of my child. For a long time, she just stood there, the dust from her father's wagon settling around her worn shoes. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier than any sound. This was it, the end. She was a piece of trash thrown on our refuse pile, and the owner of that pile was inside that cabin. Every story she'd ever heard about Jonas clawed at her mind. A man who broke horses with his bare hands. A man who had killed another in a bar fight over a spilled drink. A man whose rage was as vast as the badlands he inhabited. She was pregnant, weak and utterly at his mercy. Her hand trembled as she clutched the small bundle to her chest, expecting the door to be thrown open, to be dragged inside to face the inevitable brutality. But the door remained closed. The silence stretched, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind. Finally, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand, she took one step, then another, until she was on the small warped porch. She couldn't bring herself to knock. Then the door opened. It didn't fly open with rage. It scraped slowly, heavily across the floorboards, and he was there. The word giant was an understatement. He filled the entire doorway, a mountain of a man with the shoulders that seemed to block out the sun. His hair was long and unkempt, his beard thick, and his hands looked large enough to crush stone. Elara flinched, a small choked sound escaping her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow, for the rough voice to bark at her, but nothing came. When she dared to open her eyes, he was still just watching her. His gaze wasn't cruel. It wasn't leering or angry. It was just heavy. It was the gaze of a man looking at something profoundly broken, a gaze that held an abyss of its own sorrow. He looked haunted. He stepped back, a silent invitation, motioning her inside with a tilt of his head. His voice, when it finally came, was a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep underground. "Get in, you'll catch your death." It wasn't a request. It was a simple statement of fact. Elara shuffled past him, careful not to brush against him, her entire body rigid with fear. The cabin was sparse, but surprisingly clean. One room, one large bed in the corner, a stone hearth with a low burning fire, a small table. It smelled of cedar, old leather, and an overwhelming, crushing solitude. He didn't speak again. He simply pointed a large finger toward the bed. "Yours," he rumbled. Elara stared, confused. The only bed? He ignored her confusion, moving to the hearth where a pot hung over the fire. He ladled a thick, dark stew into a wooden bowl, added a piece of dark bread, and set it on the table. Then he poured a cup of water from a pail and set it beside the bowl. He did all of this with a strange, detached efficiency, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were tending to a spooked animal. This was not the monster she had been promised. This was something else entirely, something far more confusing. The stories were of a brute, a man of pure, animalistic rage. This man was quiet. He was a ghost in his own home. His kindness was unnerving because it felt impersonal, almost automatic, yet undeniably protective. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't touched her. He had given her food and the only bed. Elara found herself torn, her terror warring with a baffling sense of safety. Should she fear this silent giant, or was he just as broken as she was? He turned, not to sit with her, but to face the fire, his back to her. A massive, unmoving silhouette. He wasn't just avoiding her. He was actively avoiding her gaze. He hadn't truly looked her in the eyes since she'd entered. It wasn't her shame he couldn't face. It was something in his own. Elara sat stiffly on the edge of the bed, the warm bowl of stew steaming on the table, untouched. She had traded the loud, sharp cruelty of her father for the crushing, silent sorrow of this stranger. She didn't know which was worse. She sat on the edge of the bed, the unfamiliar warmth of the stew spreading through her, a stark contrast to the icy dread in her veins. He had not moved, had not spoken again. He just existed, a massive, brooding presence at the hearth. He was feeding the low fire, adding small pieces of kindling with a meticulous, almost tender care that seemed completely at odds with the brute the world knew him to be. He was a man of agonizing contradictions, and the not knowing was a torture worse than any threat. He shifted, turning his body just enough that the flickering orange light of the fire illuminated his profile, the strong line of his jaw, hidden beneath the rough beard, the straight bridge of his nose, the way his brow cast a deep shadow over his eyes. Elara's breath hitched. Her hand, holding the wooden spoon, froze halfway to her mouth. That shadow, that line, it was impossible. But her mind, reeling from fear and exhaustion, snagged on the image, pulling it violently from the one and only night she had ever felt, a moment of dangerous, reckless freedom. It was 9 months ago, the Harvest Moon Festival. It was the only night of the year Redemption Creek allowed itself to be loud. The one night the suffocating piety of the town loosened its collar. Lanterns were strung between the buildings, glowing like captured stars, and the sound of a fiddle cut through the crisp autumn air. The air didn't smell of dust and judgment. It smelled of spiced cider, roasted corn, and the sweet, sharp scent of hay. Elara was supposed to be standing dutifully at her father's booth, serving cider with downcast eyes, a perfect portrait of modest, plain obedience. But the music had pulled at her, a physical thing, a promise of a life she would never be allowed to live. Her father was deep in conversation with the mayor, his back to her, and she had done the unthinkable. She had slipped away. She hadn't even known where she was going, just running, her heart pounding against her ribs, a thrilling, terrifying pulse of pure rebellion. She ran past the edge of the light, past the laughing families, and into the deep shadows behind the livery stables, just needing to breathe air that wasn't heavy with the scent of Silas Croft's approval, and that's where she had collided with him, a solid wall of muscle and flannel. She had stumbled back, gasping, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the scream. He was leaning against the stable wall, a figure so immense he seemed to be part of the structure, watching the distant glow of the festival, a man observing a world he could never join. "You shouldn't be back here, miss," he had rumbled, the same voice, the exact same voice. It wasn't angry, just low and surprisingly gentle. She should have run. She knew who he was, or at least what he was, the outcast, the giant, the man her father and the other respectable men spoke of with disgust and fear, Jonas. But he hadn't moved to grab her. He just looked at her, and in the dim spill of the lantern light, his eyes weren't cold or cruel. They were just lonely. "Neither should you," she had found herself whispering, her defiance a tiny, fragile thing. A low sound vibrated in his chest, almost a laugh. "I'm not allowed where the music is." She had looked down at her own plain dress, feeling the invisible cage of her father's expectations. "Me neither," she'd admitted. "Not really." He had looked at her then, really looked at her, with a strange, quiet curiosity. He didn't see Silas Croft's disappointing daughter. He just saw her. They talked. It wasn't much. He asked her name. She told him. He talked about the moon, about how the stars looked different from the badlands. He was quiet and sad, and for 10 minutes he made her feel like the only person in the world. In that shared moment of impossible isolation under the light of the harvest moon, a spark had passed. It was reckless, forbidden, and over in an instant, a secret moment of warmth in a lifetime of cold. When she'd finally hurried back to the festival, her secret was a terrible, beautiful burning thing in her chest. The wooden spoon clattered from her numb fingers, landing on the rough floor with a dull thud. The man at the fire turned his head. Jonas. His eyes, now empty and haunted, met hers across the small, dim room. It was him. The kind, lonely stranger from the livery, the man from the harvest moon, was the monster in the cabin. Her father hadn't just sent her to a giant. He had, in an act of impossible biblical cruelty, sent her to the father of her child. A new, colder wave of terror washed over her, a dread so profound it stole the air from her lungs. She understood his silence now, the haunted look, the way he wouldn't meet her gaze. He knew. He had to know. He recognized her. He knew this was his child, and his silence wasn't kindness. It was judgment. Or worse. What if he didn't recognize her? What if she was so changed, so swollen and broken that he didn't see the girl from that night at all? Which was worse, to be recognized and hated for the trouble she was bringing him, or to be so completely forgotten by the one man who had ever shown her a moment of tenderness? Her hand flew to her belly, a protective, instinctive gesture. This baby wasn't just her shame anymore. It was his legacy. And he was looking at her right now as if she were a ghost, a problem her father had delivered to his doorstep. The question that had been, "What will this monster do to me?" vanished, replaced by a far more terrifying one. What will he do when he knows? The first few days passed in a thick, vibrating silence. A routine, unspoken and fragile, began to form. Elara would wake on the bed. He had not once offered to take it back, sleeping instead on a rough pallet of furs by the fire, to find a cup of water and a piece of bread on the table. He would be gone before the sun was fully up, tending to his sparse patch of land or mending fences, his massive form a distant silhouette against the endless sky. He would return at dusk, prepare a simple meal, and they would eat in the same suffocating silence. He was a ghost who took up too much space, a protector who never spoke. His kindness was a language she was only just beginning to understand, and it was spoken entirely through action. He never asked her about the baby. He never asked her about her father. He never asked her anything at all, but he saw. He saw the way she pressed her hands into the small of her back, wincing. The next day, a small, firm pillow, clearly old but clean, appeared on the bed. He saw the way she struggled to bend over to pull on her worn shoes. One evening, after a long day when the baby had felt impossibly heavy, she sat rubbing her swollen ankles, tears of frustration and pain welling in her eyes. He was by the fire, sharpening a knife, the scrape of metal on stone the only sound. He stopped. He watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he rose, took a pail, and went outside. He returned with water, which he heated over the fire, adding a handful of something from a small leather pouch, some kind of dried herb. He placed the steaming basin on the floor in front of her. Not a word. He just set it down and returned to his seat by the fire. Elara stared at the basin, then at his broad, unmoving back. A sob caught in her throat. She slowly lowered her feet into the hot, fragrant water. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. It was the most profound act of tenderness anyone had ever shown her. It was this quiet, emerging trust that made the outside world feel even harsher. A week after her arrival, a rider approached. It wasn't her father. It was a man named Harker, one of Silas's cronies, a man whose eyes always lingered too long, his thin lips perpetually curled in a sneer. He reined in his horse near the porch, where Jonas was splitting wood. "Silas sent me," Harker called out, his voice oily. "Wants to know the problem is being handled, that she ain't run off." Jonas didn't stop the motion of his axe. It swung down, splitting a log with a clean, definitive thunk. "She's here," Harker laughed. "A nasty, high-pitched sound. Good. He said you'd know what to do with damaged goods. Guess even a giant gets lonely, eh?" He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, his eyes flicking to the cabin door, where he knew Elara was listening. Elara's blood ran cold. She felt the shame her father spoke of, a hot, filthy thing. The sound of the axe stopped. Jonas slowly turned. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move quickly. He simply looked at Harker, and the air around him went dead. "Get off my land," he rumbled. Harker's smile faltered, but he held his ground. "Just doing my job, Jonas." "Silas?" Jonas took one step forward. "I said, get off my land. And if you or he or any other man from that town comes here again, I will take it as a threat, and you won't ride back." There was no rage in his voice. It was colder than that. It was a promise. It was the sound of a mountain deciding to fall. Harker's bravado evaporated. He saw the truth in Jonas's eyes, and it terrified him. He pulled his horse's reins, turning so fast the animal reared and galloped away, not looking back. Elara was shaking. She stood in the doorway, one hand on her belly, the other on the frame. He had defended her. He had stood up for her. He hadn't just protected her body. He had protected her dignity. He had called Harker's words a threat. He didn't see her as damaged goods. This protector, this silent, haunted man, was the only decent man she had ever known. The urge to tell him, to finally bridge the silence with the truth, was so strong it was a physical ache in her chest. She had to. He deserved to know. He had proven himself. That evening, as he sat by the fire, his hands mending a piece of leather, she took a breath. "Jonas?" He stopped his work, looking up. She opened her mouth, but the words died. The fear, cold and familiar, flooded back in. He had protected her as a stranger, as a woman wronged. How would he react when he learned she was the mother of his child? That she had brought this shame to his door twice? He would see her as a liar, a manipulator. This fragile, unspoken trust would shatter. This kind, protective man would disappear, and the monster everyone else saw would finally emerge. She looked down. The stew was good. Thank you." He just nodded once and returned to his work. The chasm of their shared secret, unspoken and vast, gaping between them. The change didn't come slowly. It came like a crack of lightning. The heavy, oppressive stillness of the prairie afternoon was shattered by a sudden, violent shift in the air. The sky, a pale, dusty blue for weeks, had turned a deep, bruised purple, and the wind began to howl. Not just whistling, but screaming, a raw, tormented sound. It was the kind of storm that didn't just pass over the land, but seemed to rise up from it. A physical manifestation of all the unspoken tension, all the dread. And as the first fat, cold drops of rain began to hammer against the cabin roof, Elara's body answered in kind. A sharp, searing pain, unlike anything she had ever known, ripped through her, stealing her breath and bending her double. She cried out, a high, thin sound of pure animal fear. The cup she was holding fell, shattering on the floor. Jonas, who had been standing at the window watching the approaching storm, was at her side in an instant. The brooding, haunted man was gone, replaced by a figure of pure, focused energy. "It's time," he rumbled, his voice not a question but a statement. He didn't wait for her answer. He moved with a speed that seemed impossible for his size. He grabbed the pail, ran out into the lashing rain to fill it, and had it over the fire to boil before Elara could even process the second wave of pain. He threw clean rags on the table. He stoked the fire until it roared, fighting back against the sudden icy chill that had invaded the cabin. Elara was terrified, sinking onto the bed, her hands clutching her belly. "I can't," she wept, the words torn from her. "Jonas, I'm scared. I can't do this." He came to her, kneeling by the bed, his massive scarred hands she had seen split logs with a single blow, gently took her face. He forced her to look at him, and his eyes were no longer distant or haunted. They were present, a blazing, steady anchor in the terrifying chaos. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice low and firm, cutting through her panic. "You are not alone. I am right here. You are safe. Breathe with me, Elara." It was the first time he had said her name with such force. He didn't leave her side. For hours, the storm outside and the storm inside her body raged in a terrible symphony. The wind tore at the cabin and the pain tore at her. She screamed. She cried. She gripped his arm with a strength she didn't know she possessed, her nails digging into his skin. He never flinched. He was a mountain, solid and unmoving, absorbing her pain, her fear, her rage. He wiped her brow with a cool, damp cloth. He gave her water. He spoke to her, not with platitudes, but with simple, raw commands. "Breathe. Push. You're almost there. I have you." Then, in a moment, where the world seemed to split open, the thunder cracked directly overhead, and Elara gave one final guttural scream. It was followed an instant later by a new sound, a thin, sharp, piercing cry that cut through the noise of the storm like a blade. The wind, the rain, the thunder, it all seemed to fade into a distant roar. There was only that sound, life. Elara collapsed back, sobbing, sweat-drenched and utterly spent. Jonas, his hands shaking for the first time, gently lifted the small, slippery body. "It's a son," he whispered, his voice thick, breaking on the word. He wrapped the baby in a clean cloth, and for a moment he just stared at the child in his massive hands. He looked at the tiny, perfect face, the dark fuzz of hair, the small, curled fists, and then the baby opened his eyes. Jonas's breath caught in his chest. It was like being struck by lightning all over again. He was staring at his own eyes, the same dark, deep, unreadable eyes that he saw in his reflection every morning. It wasn't a resemblance. It was a mirror. The 9 months of silence, the harvest moon, the girl from the festival, the shame, the hidden truth. It all converged in that single devastating, clarifying instant. He looked up, his gaze locking with Elara's. His face was pale, undone, a mask of shock and a profound, soul-shattering recognition. He didn't need to ask. He already knew. Elara saw the realization dawn in his eyes. The dam of her fear, her shame, her terrible, lonely secret, finally broke. "Jonas," she whispered, the tears streaming down her face. He's yours." The confession hung in the suddenly quiet air. "From the festival, the harvest moon. I didn't know how to tell you. I was so scared that you would hate me." She braced herself for the rage, for the monster to finally emerge. Jonas just stood there for a long moment, the tiny, perfect truth of his son nestled in his arms. He looked from the baby to the woman, and all the anger he'd held at the world, at Silas, at his own cursed life, seemed to drain away, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a decade, a purpose. He slowly walked to the bed and knelt, placing the baby on Elara's chest, his hand covering them both. He looked at her, and the haunted giant was gone. In his place was a father. He raised his other hand, massive and trembling, and gently rested it on her head. "I know," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she couldn't name. "I see him." The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and deceptively quiet. For 3 days, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. It was a new world, defined by the small, demanding presence in Elara's arms. She and Jonas had found a new rhythm, one of quiet, shared purpose. He would hold the baby, his son, his massive, scarred hands looking impossibly gentle against the child's tiny frame. They spoke, not much, but enough. The great, terrible secret was out, and in its place something new and tentative was beginning to grow. But the high, thin cry of a newborn travels on the prairie wind, and the prairie wind eventually blows back to town. Harker, sent by Silas to ensure the problem had been permanently buried, had ridden close enough to hear it. He returned to Redemption Creek, not with news of a tragedy, but of a birth. For Silas Croft, this was not a resolution. It was an escalation. The shame he had tried to exile had now taken root. It had a name. It had a cry. It was a living, breathing testament to his failure, a stain that could no longer be hidden in the badlands. It had to be eradicated. His reputation, his standing in the church, his entire sense of self was built on a foundation of unblemished virtue. A bastard grandchild born to an outcast giant was a crack that would bring the whole facade crumbling down. He wasn't just angry. He was righteous. He was a man on a holy mission to cleanse his bloodline. This time, he didn't ride alone. He brought Harker and another man, both armed, both loyal to the power of his money, if not his morals. This was not a visit. It was an extraction. The sound of their approach was heavy, a dull, thudding warning. Jonas, who was outside mending the fence Harker had passed by, heard them first. He saw the 3 riders, silhouetted against the morning sun, and his face hardened. He moved back to the cabin, entering quietly. Elara was by the fire, humming a small, tuneless song to the baby who was nestled in her arms. She looked up, sensing the shift in the air. "What is it?" Jonas didn't have to answer. The cabin door burst open, slamming against the wall, making the pots rattle. Silas Croft stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold, white-hot fury. His eyes, burning with a zealot's fire, bypassed Jonas completely and locked onto Elara. He didn't see a daughter. He saw a sin. "Give me the child," he commanded. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the small cabin, sharp and cold as an icicle. Elara recoiled, her body instinctively curling around the baby, a visceral protective shield. "What?" she whispered, her newfound peace shattering into 1,000 pieces. "It is an abomination," Silas spat, stepping into the room. Harker and the other man flanked him, their hands resting on their holstered guns, filling the small space with a thick, violent tension. "You have sullied my name for the last time, Elara. I am ending this. The child will be sent to the orphanage in the capital. It will be given a new name, and it will never know the filth it was born from." "No," Elara said, the word a raw, desperate plea. "No, you can't." Before she could even find her feet, Jonas moved. He didn't rush. He simply stepped, placing his massive frame directly between Silas and Elara, a human wall. He said nothing. His presence was the only answer necessary. Silas finally turned his gaze on the giant, his lip curling in disgust. You were paid to handle this. You were meant to be her keeper, her punishment, not her guard. Step aside, beast. This is a family matter. He gestured to his men. A silent order. Harker took a step forward, his hand moving to his gun. The boss said. Jonas's hand shot out, not with anger, but with the terrifying speed of a striking snake. He didn't grab the gun. He grabbed Harker's wrist. The sound of bones grinding against each other, a wet, sickening crunch, filled the cabin. Harker screamed, a high-pitched, agonizing sound, and dropped to his knees, clutching his mangled hand. The other man froze, his hand hovering over his own weapon, his eyes wide with terror. Silas himself took an involuntary step back, his mask of righteous fury cracking for just a second, to reveal the fear beneath. Jonas hadn't drawn a weapon. He was the weapon. Elara, holding her baby, found her voice. It wasn't the terrified whisper of the girl who had been abandoned. It was the deep, resonant growl of a mother. You will not touch him, she said, her voice shaking with a rage that matched her father's. You will not take my son. Silas, recovering his composure, pointed a trembling finger at her. Your son? You have no say, girl. You are nothing. That thing is a blight. I will have it, even if I have to burn this cabin to the ground with you in it. He was desperate, a man cornered by his own pride. He looked at his remaining man. Draw your weapon. Take the child. But as Silas issued the command, his eyes fell on the baby, truly seeing it for the first time. The baby, woken by the shouting, had turned its head, and Silas, even in his blind rage, saw it. He saw the dark, deep-set eyes. He saw the shape of the brow. He saw the unmistakable features of the giant standing in front of him. Jonas's voice, when it came, was no longer a rumble. It was a low, clear, and deadly vibration that shook the very foundations of the room. This is not your land, he said, his gaze locked on Silas. This is not your daughter. He paused, letting the silence stretch before delivering the final, devastating blow. And that is not your child to take. He is mine. The words, he is mine, echoed in the sudden, terrible silence of the cabin. They were simple words, but they landed with the force of a final judgment, a truth that shattered the very foundation of Silas Croft's world. He stared, his face a mask of disbelief, his mind scrambling to comprehend the impossible. The righteous fury that had carried him here, that had fueled his entire life, sputtered and died, replaced by a cold, sickening wave of realization. He, Silas Croft, in his blind, pious arrogance, had sought to punish his daughter for her shame by casting her out, and he had, in an act of perfect, damning irony, delivered her directly into the hands of the very man who was the source of it. He hadn't banished his problem. He had given it refuge. He had paid her keeper to protect his own bloodline. You? Silas finally whispered, the word choked, incredulous. His gaze snapped from Jonas's unmoving face to Elara's. He saw her now, truly saw her, not as his ruined daughter, but as the vessel of his ultimate biblical humiliation. He had been outmaneuvered, not by a man, but by a fate he himself had set in motion. The second hired man, seeing the entire dynamic of the confrontation implode, seeing his employer, the most powerful man in town, standing utterly undone, wanted no part of what came next. This was no longer a job. It was a reckoning. He quietly backed toward the door, grabbed the whimpering, white-faced Harker by the collar, and dragged him out into the sunlight. The sound of their horses galloping away was a distant, fading echo, leaving the three of them, father, daughter, and grandfather, alone in the heavy quiet. The threat was gone. The guns were gone. All that remained was the truth. Silas's face, which had been pale with rage, contorted. He looked at the baby, nestled securely in Elara's arms, then at Jonas, who had not moved, had not flinched, his very presence an unbreachable wall. A child of shame, Silas spat, the words a last desperate attempt to reclaim his narrative, to wound them with the only weapon he had left. He was trying to cast the final stone, to name the sin and separate himself from it. Jonas took one deliberate step, not toward Silas, but beside Elara. He placed one of his massive hands on her shoulder, a gesture of pure, unshakable ownership. His other hand came to rest on his son's head. His fingers played gently over the dark fuzz of hair. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer cold or threatening. It was calm. It was deep. It was the sound of the earth settling after a quake. "He's not shamed," Jonas said, his gaze locked on Silas. "He's my son." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting Silas understand the finality of it. "He is my legacy." Elara, feeling the steady, warm weight of Jonas's hand on her shoulder, a feeling of pure, unshakable support she had never known, finally met her father's eyes. The girl who had been dragged from her home, the girl who had flinched at his voice, was gone. In her place was a mother, a partner, a survivor. There was no fear left in her gaze. There was no pleading. There was only a vast, cold pity. "You have no power here, Father," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting the last thread that bound her to him. "You have no shame to give us. You gave all that away when you left me on this porch." Silas looked at the three of them, the giant, the ruined daughter, and the baby. They were not broken. They were not cowering. They were a fortress. They were a single, complete unit. And he, in his perfectly respectable clothes, with his perfectly ordered life, was the one on the outside. He was the outcast. He had lost. He had not just failed to cleanse his name. He had sealed his own humiliation, creating the very family he had sought to destroy. Without another word, Silas Croft, the pillar of Redemption Creek, turned. His shoulders, which had always been held rigid with pride, were slumped. The granite certainty that had defined him was shattered. He walked out of the cabin, a man utterly undone, and rode away, defeated not by a gun, but by a truth he himself had delivered. Elara and Jonas stood in the silence, listening to the sound of the hoofbeats fade until there was only the sound of the wind and the baby's soft breathing. The tension of the past 9 months, the fear, the isolation, finally broke. Elara let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned her head against Jonas's solid frame. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her and their son close, his hand covering them both. They were 3 outcasts, a giant, a shamed woman, and a child born of a secret. But here in this small, rough cabin in the middle of the badlands, they were not outcasts. They were just a family. Elara looked up at Jonas, and he looked down at her, a silent, shared promise passing between them. And in the quiet, in the vast, open prairie, their new life, their legacy, had truly begun. The West wasn't just built by legends. It was built by survivors, by the outcasts, the shamed, and the silent heroes who found kindness in the harshest of lands. If you believe true strength isn't about the gun you carry, but the burdens you're willing to bear for others, then you belong here. Follow True Western Stories and subscribe now so you never miss a single story of the real untamed heart of the West.